From an outsider perspective, Los Angeles, California has always been a bit of a mystical place. A city crafted by the legends of Hollywood, ripe with the promise of prosperity and the American dream. A beautiful semi-tropical paradise. Yet, it is also a city that holds within itself an intense duality, as beneath this golden sheen of sunlight lies a dark, isolating, and merciless underbelly, rotten to the core with crime, corruption, and sin. And it was showcasing this living contradiction of a city that was the goal of 2011's LA Noire. A game set in 1947, LA Noire has you playing as the up-and-coming detective Cole Phelps, as he navigates the twists and turns of the urban jungle and police force. Developed by Team Bondi under the watch of Rockstar Games, this release took on the daunting task of recreating this historic city lost to time. Not a fictionalized Los Angeles like Los Santos, or a condensed version of the real thing, but a true-to-life recreation. A surprisingly uncommon goal for a game, especially when contrasted with the other Rockstar worlds such as Los Santos or Liberty City, which aim only to be interpretations of their real-life counterparts, being highly curated and modified game maps. But by contrast, 1947 Los Angeles in this game is 1947 Los Angeles. From its streets, to its storefronts, to its scenic views, LA Noire sought to recreate this city as it was. And it was this commitment to realism that is both the game's greatest triumph, as well as its greatest failing. And on top of all of this, it was also an homage to film noir, the genre of dark mystery movies that helped define the late 40s and 50s America. These were films that were frequently set in Los Angeles, and not only showcased the city, but also captured its spirit. And likewise, LA Noire aimed to take up the same task, virtually recreating the lost days of the City of Angels, whilst also seeking to capture its feel and essence. And so, we're going to look at how Team Bondi worked to achieve this. We'll look at the specifics of how the art team achieved their vision, as well as analyze the areas where I think the game succeeded, and where I think it fell short. So, welcome to Crafting Worlds, a series in which we analyze and pay respect to the unique achievements of video game world building and visual design. So, if you love video game art, be sure to subscribe for many more videos to come. But now, let's dive into the heart of West Coast America. But before we get to the game itself, we first need to understand and appreciate the history and context of the city whose spirit Team Bondi sought to revive. It's crazy to think, but despite being the enormous, sprawling powerhouse of a metropolis we know today, at the dawn of the 20th century, Los Angeles had a minuscule population of only around 100,000 residents. Unlike densely packed New York City, which sat comfortably at around 3.5 million. Like all North American cities, LA was at one point just another bummy little frontier town. Yet one that was ripe for massive expansion. And expand it did, in the wake of some very savvy marketing, which advertised the quote-unquote semi-tropical Golden State as a place of near-endless available land, one in a constant state of sunshine and fertility. Much like the Hollywood fantasies it would eventually produce, the Big Orange was crafted on the back of a utopian promise. A promised land, one where anyone could come and recreate themselves, an image the city still maintains to this day. And so the hordes of eager settlers came, with the city's population skyrocketing in the 20s and 30s. And this was to be envisioned as a city of the future, one eager to stand as the golden alternative to the cramped vertical design of New York and Chicago, with their unending hordes of high-rises and skyscrapers. Thus, LA spread out horizontally across the Los Angeles basin, with its population reaching close to 2 million people by the end of the 40s. Which takes us to the year of LA Noir, 1947. Halfway to the new millennium, now it was an established international city with a global image. Yet from our modern perspective, it was still a mere shadow of what it would become. A time before the massive post-war suburbs and highways were constructed, and before Googie architecture and surf culture took hold of America. Yet, 1947 was a turnkey year, one that would pave the way for the modern LA. With the post-war economy blooming and high employment rates, there was a sense of great optimism in the spirit of America and her cities. Yet beneath that, a growing seed of cynicism took hold. The very definition of bitterness, film noir was a genre of crime films, ones that were infused with many conflicting feelings. Those of fatigue and poverty coming off the Great Depression, combined with the horror and trauma men still felt from having fought in World War II. Having suffered through a decade and a half of national trauma, the directors and artists who created this massive backlog of genre films painted a bleak picture of American life. Stories of hard times, gangsters, jaded detectives, and plotting femme fatales. Movies with storylines that revolved around framed murders and political corruption. Painted in a visual aesthetic defined by dark exteriors, hard light photography, and black, nightmarish dreamscapes. And not just a reflection of past trauma, these films also commented on America's growing contemporary issues like sexual taboos, the rapid rise of narcotic abuse, and the rightful fear of corrupt government officials and police. And it's these two contradictory myths that make an LA noir such a compelling idea for a game. You look at historical New York, and you see a loud, abrasive, and decrepit city, densely packed, visibly dirty, and physically scarred. Seeing New York in this era, you'd expect nothing but crime, corruption, and murder to come from it. But Los Angeles was subtle. It was clean and concealing, its darkness buried deep within its suburbs and back alley offices. And there's something inherently more shocking about seeing this secret darkness in what has been presented to you as this striking, beautiful fantasy land. In this sense, noir is the dark counter-fantasy to the California fantasy. It is the nightmare within the dream. And this defined the spirit of the city. Yet neither one of these impressions tells the complete truth, for there are two other contradicting sides to the City of Angels: the fantastical and the realistic. Most of us have been exposed to the fantastical LA all our lives through movies, media, and childhood trips to Disneyland. These idealized or darkened, abstract impressions of the city. And so it can be easy to forget that this is also just a real flesh and blood place, and never engage with it as it actually is. But luckily, LA Noir cut through most of this abstraction, aiming to showcase the authentic Los Angeles with realism, arguably too much of it. And so with this long-winded history established, let's finally turn our attention to this captivating game. First, looking at the real side of the city, to see how LA Noir physically recreated this enticing, lost slice of America. So here you are as Cole Phelps, patrolling the streets of Los Angeles as you rise through the ranks of the LAPD, going from beat cop to traffic detective to homicide, vice, and so on. And this, right here, is what you're going to be doing for half of it. Driving. As mentioned before, LA is a lateral city, and to get anywhere in it, you have to own a vehicle. Machines that define the Los Angeles lifestyle, which you'll be seeing a lot of. Because unlike the usual condensed Rockstar map, within the space between the Los Angeles River and Hollywood Boulevard, this is pretty much an exact recreation, across all 8 or so square miles of it. And this is where production designer Simon Wood, lead artist Ben Brundle, and art director Chi Kin Chan come into play, as they began their daunting task of recreating this huge space. First by extensively analyzing city maps, creating a grid of all the buildings, streets, parks, and so on, which was then overlaid on top of a 3D geological map of the area, meaning that a drive from the 6th Street Viaduct to 220 North Broadview is almost completely historically accurate, both in urban content as well as physical layout. Though by today's standards, this is no longer all that impressive. Games like Microsoft Flight Simulator have done this for practically the entire world now, creating accurate auto-generated cities and landmasses based on real-life map data. But what LA Noire has, that those games don't, is a level of historical accuracy and up-close detail. From the big buildings all the way down to the scraps of poster paper left on the walls. You look at live-action footage from the street of late 40s LA, and yeah, in broad strokes it's pretty much one-to-one. Making this possible, the art team got access to the newspaper photo vault at UCLA, among other collections, which gave them near limitless access to period photos that showed them the life of the streets, both from the ground and from the sky. And this was paramount, as production designer Simon Wood said, "The cliché is a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, we used 180,000 photos." This extensive research shows bigly. The roads are lined with hundreds of unique street signs, each with that beaming happy-go-lucky charm of post-war branding. In this time, an enormous chunk of LA was geared towards tourism and commercial shopping, and so to capture this in its full scope, the team created over 600 unique storefronts, showcasing everything from boutiques to delis, tobacco shops to record stores. However, one criticism I do have of the Overworld, it's the lack of area-appropriate NPCs. While a lot of work went into dressing the NPCs in period-perfect attire, they don't always feel well integrated or appropriately placed in the world. Strangely enough, I couldn't find any Chinese NPCs in Chinatown, and large industrial districts were oddly full of pedestrians and produce grocers, selling fresh fruit right up next to the smokestacks. And most of the time, these characters just stand around looking soulless and saying weird shit.
As the cannibals finished off eating the clown, one said, "Did that taste funny to you?"
Maybe I'm making assumptions about who would be where, but it doesn't feel right. It's just clear that not a lot of work went into these NPCs, and it's not a huge deal, but when you compare it to Rockstar's other games, it does feel very lacking. And I think this would be a good time to point out the massive span of development hell that this game went through. The final build of LA Noire came out a total of 6 years after the initial release date, after tens of millions of dollars had already been wasted on the project. And you can see the result of this in the weird character animation, the very loose shooting physics, and most noticeably, in the steep lack of interactive overworld content. I recommend Matt McMuscle's video on the subject if you're interested in learning more, which I'll link in the description. But suffice to say, the development troubles are very evident in the final game's overworld. But then again, the meat of LA Noire is in the interrogations and crime scenes, so maybe I'm holding the overworld to too high a standard. All this place needed to be, really, was just filler space between the key locations. But in spite of that, as I've pointed out, there is genuinely a lot of nice fine visual detail to soak in if you choose to. Details that were probably not entirely necessary. For example, just look at all the Art Deco design that's on display. Art Deco being a sleek, futuristic style popular during those years. Just think of the Chrysler Building or the Great Gatsby and you get the idea. In everything from the signage, to the bridges, to the public offices, you can see that Los Angeles was, for a good time, a deco paradise. Which makes sense given that most of what this city was built in the 1920s and 30s. It really makes you understand and appreciate how this city was able to solidify its image as this fresh beacon of the future. Exploring this world from the Bullocks, Wilshire to the towering City Hall, you can't stop seeing that opulent and extravagant tile work, or those unmistakably decorative, low-relief windows and entrances. Work that lets you appreciate the designers of this land and their commitment to modernity. The Big Orange was, in many ways, one of the first cities to define the 20th century. But again, despite all the richness in the tiny details, and my raving praise in the past few minutes, I gotta admit, when I pull back from these finer details and look at the game map just as a whole, it does all sort of start to blend in together. Downtown streets bleed into industrial hell bleeds into the suburbs, and the suburbs bleed into more suburbs, which in turn only bleed into more suburbs. Which, I can't really knock the game for. That's just sort of how LA is and was. As author Aldous Huxley once said, Los Angeles is just 19 suburbs in search of a metropolis. It also just doesn't have any of the traditional charm of a city. Just as soon as you've stumbled into a stretch of land that actually resembles a congested downtown core, soon enough you'll be making your way out of it, staring out at some big empty lot under development. And yeah, the entire map does, after a while, feel needlessly big and incredibly grid-like. An endless maze of concrete and asphalt, where a body can be left out in the open in a public park at midnight and only then be discovered 8 hours later. Quickly, exploring the map of LA Noire becomes a very lonely experience. With its endless backlots and cookie-cutter neighborhoods, it's not a super enjoyable world to exist in. And while you may always be being trailed by your NPC partner, he soon starts to feel like a robot just following you around everywhere. With him, the mindless pedestrians, and the automated traffic, there's a real sense of stillness and artificiality in this world. Like a moment frozen in time. It's like stepping into an Edward Hopper painting. Beautiful and picturesque, but sadly isolating at the same time. However, if I did find one attractive feature, it would be in the older SoCal suburbs. Made with California's signature redwoods, these older houses are bright, cheerful, and have a lot more character than a lot of their suburban successors. Although, unfortunately, most of these houses have since been lost to time, leading to a real loss of color in this city, which is evident even in this game, which can feel like a real colorless void. And you can't really blame the devs for that. They did extensive research into the most popular paint colors and building supplies of 1947, and so they were just reproducing things as they were. But to close out this point, I do think there's a lot of character to be found here on this map if you look hard enough. But by the 11th or 12th case, it's already gotten pretty damn old. And a lot of this soullessness is mostly the result of faulty development planning, and the team's lack of time and resources to flesh it all out. But, in a weird way, it's actually kind of historically appropriate. By most accounts, traversing real-life LA is also an infinitely tedious process. Even if there were minigames and smarter NPCs on this map, would traveling around it really be any less mind-numbing? Probably not. And contrary to what some might say, I think the dullness of this overworld is somewhat less a result of the game's troubled development, and more so a result of the decision to pursue realism. Even if they did add some extra frills here and there, would it really have made driving through LA fun? Me, I don't think so. When you really cut away all of the glitz and glamour and pretensions of LA, you begin to see that, really, it's just another American city. But that begs the question, should realism take precedent over fun and enjoyability? After all, a historically empty wasteland is still an empty wasteland. GTA 5 takes place in a fictionalized version of Southern California for a reason, so that they could make a world map that actually felt dynamic and fun to traverse. And sure, you can always fast travel, but really, isn't that just an equally unfun compromise? It makes me feel as though maybe the open world in this game was just a result of the times. After all, this was at a point in gaming where suddenly everything needed to be sandboxed in order to sell. Despite the fact that this game probably could have operated just as well with a point-and-click map, letting you hop from one isolated location to another. Look, I have no doubt Simon Wood and the other head art developers were very passionate about making this big map. But when you really look at it, really in my opinion, everything outside of the smaller, intimate, character-oriented scenes is kinda filler. But luckily, it's these core scenes that really deliver, as they're brought to life by this game's wonderful interior design. Thankfully, these are the areas that almost make up for the monotony of the overworld. The setting used for action scenes, interrogations, and inspections are all very well fleshed out. The inside of any accessible apartment, business, or public office expresses a depth of detail even greater than that of the overworld, and in a much more compact and selectively curated way. Each of the living spaces presented in the game reveals so much about their owner. Each one feels specifically designed to reflect their hobbies, income, lifestyle, aesthetic tastes, religion, you name it. So much so that you almost feel like an invasive voyeur in these people's homes, which in a way, you are. As a detective, it's your job to dig through people's dirty laundry. Very literally, in fact, revealing so much about these people's inner lives. The same is equally true of the stores and bars, with each fitting the vision and personality of its proprietors to a T. For example, there's a beautiful sort of harmony that exists between this schlubby barber and his down and dirty blue-collar watering hole, or even this kitschy club owner and his goofy tiki torch-filled venue. Even two small gun shops can have two completely different types of decor. And then there's Hollywood, a side of the city which is in many ways very easily mockable, with its over-the-top personalities and corny locales like the Chinese and Egyptian-themed theaters. But in its own way, it can also be legitimately grand and impressive, such as with the towering, monumental recreation of the set of D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. Easily the game's best locale, and one of the few to be showcased multiple times throughout the campaign. It's all great stuff and fun to look at. And within this eclectic town, you really rub elbows with every type of citizen. All the characters you would expect from LA. A naive, newly arrived out-of-town girl who dreams of becoming a star. A dingy, down-on-his-luck mechanic whose wife is cheating on him. A pretentious would-be writer, sketchy gangsters in zoot suits, the gang's all here. As famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright once said, "Tip the world over on its side and everything loose will land in Los Angeles." And to me, more than anything, that is reflected in its eclectic population. Almost all of its residents seem to be from somewhere else, there in pursuit of something different, which of course is reflected in their clothing and their spaces. And so it's no surprise that along the journey of development, the art team visited, photographed, and scanned thousands of costumes and props across some of Hollywood's biggest art warehouses. and the efforts of this endeavor clearly paid off. Although, they maybe could have eased off on reusing this one bottle. And the great thing is, this extra level of detail is almost always in service of the story. In one scene, for example, when you're talking to a bartender, at 2 different points in the conversation, he mentions that A, his murdered patron only came to the bar for the backroom poker games, and B, that he, by extension, was a gambling addict. Well, out of curiosity, I looked in the back room and boom, there was a poker room. It may not be much, but it's cool to see follow through on those peripheral details. And sure enough, when you visit the dead guy's house, there's a recently used poker table there as well. And it's through small details like this that the dedication of the art team starts to peek through. And it bursts through on all sides in a place like the 100% optional sidelined recreation of Union Station. Think how many man-hours were needed to get the precise measurements of this building's interior down. Think about the time that went into copying the intricate floor and wall tiling, or the woodwork on the ticket booths. An insane amount of effort considering this is just some random spot on the map that gets no attention in the campaign. And there are so many famous LA landmarks that got similar treatment. And it's stuff like this that makes LA Noire special in my eyes. Something a lot of people might miss. But it does come with a very clear trade-off. Because, for as detailed as these select locations may be, as mentioned earlier, this is a huge map, and there are so many areas to recreate that it just couldn't all be filled in equally, nor could they reach a level of interactivity one might like. This is where you start to see the major concessions that had to be made in order to allot the time to create this giant world. A lot of environmental objects that should be destructible or movable are as stiff as concrete. You start to see certain props show up a bit too often. Landmarks like the iconic Angel's Flight are present, but you can't ride on it. You can't play poker in the poker room I mentioned earlier. The shooting galleries underneath the gun store, you can't use them. There are jukeboxes in every diner, but no tunes to play. And so on and so on. LA Noire is a game that feels spread very thin, with even the aforementioned excellent Union Station feeling more like a hollow replica model than a meaningful part of the world. But you know what? I'm not going to criticize the game too much for this. The focus of it is always on the cases, and that's where the game delivered. And so it's actually somewhat impressive that they decided to give the world this much development in spite of that. It's clear that this game was lacking when it came to programmers and animators, as is evidenced by the poor animation and lack of interactivity. But I think the artists and 3D modelers really delivered. Sure, it may feel more like a museum than a real lived-in world at times, but hey, I like museums. But given that it's my job to talk about world design, I can't fully give it a free pass, nor can I excuse the shady management practices at Team Bondi that led to this game being the way it is. There are many games that offer much smaller but infinitely more compact, interactive, and intimate feeling worlds. But as a lover of history and period pieces, a part of me can't help but love this map, flawed and incomplete as it may be. And I think that about sums it up. And this would be a good place to end things. However, thus far I've only talked about the physical makeup of the city. But as I alluded to earlier, recreating its material space was only ever half of the equation. Just as important of a goal for LA Noire was the challenge of capturing the city's essence and feeling. Its spirit, if you will. And it does do this, kind of, but this is something I feel much more mixed about. This is where we start to get into the abstract essence that I alluded to earlier. While it's easy to talk about the look and design of the city in factual terms, things like mood and feel are a lot more subjective. there are elements that are most heavily influenced by artsy touches like lighting, camera, and music. But it's these things that are responsible for recreating what I'll call the spirit of LA. Well, obviously the spirit of a place as big as this city is, in reality, going to be quite multifaceted and subjective. This game is, of course, a noir game, and so I think it's clear to say that the spirit it's trying to pursue is one of cynicism. The type of which evokes feelings of isolation, fear, crime, sex, murder, moral ambiguity, etc., etc. And Cole Phelps is a textbook example of a morally ambiguous character. While still a far more honest cop than most, Cole is a deeply flawed man with his own personal failings, traumatic past, and even occasionally questionable motives. And on a daily basis, he's dealing with issues that are naturally still very relevant today. Police corruption and brutality, sexual abuse and trafficking in the entertainment industry, and, well, murder. And so the question becomes, does LA Noire visually capture this atmosphere of violence and corruption? And the answer is, kind of. You see, when I visualize this game in my head, the first thing that comes to mind is the idyllic postcard California. Cole driving a slick car under the sunny skies on Sunset Boulevard. This is because, for the first half of the game, that being around 10 hours, probably only an hour of that time actually takes place at night. And I really don't know how to feel about this. This is a noir game. Noir, literally black. And yet it takes place predominantly during the daytime. And this is important because LA at night is just a completely different story. In the day, you miss the flashing, burning neon lights of downtown, the dark, sketchy alleyways off of Skid Row, the empty bars after hours, etc., etc. This is what I and most other people think of when they think of noir. Dark cityscapes dripping with atmosphere, high contrast black and white lighting, and surrealism. And for the first half of this game, you barely get that. Granted, you have some of these really cool dark level interludes, where we see the killer silhouetted in darkness, or the ones where you get to hear one of those iconic grizzled noir voiceovers. But for the most part, it's always sunny in Los Angeles. In contrast to this ultra-atmospheric title screen, it's not very dark and there's very little mood lighting or atmosphere. However, in an admittedly very subtle move, this does actually change at one key moment of the story, specifically when Cole gets promoted to vice detective. As a traffic detective, Cole was mostly solving small-scale petty crimes. In Homicide, he faced off against the heinous Black Dahlia murderer, in a very clear-cut good versus evil conflict. However, in the drug-related vice cases, things aren't so morally clear. Now you're dealing with citywide issues of organized crime and drug distribution. And you begin to rub shoulders with people in high places. And it becomes very obvious very quickly that things are no longer so morally clean-cut, and that there are some shady dealings going on behind the scenes, even in the LAPD. And in a very subtle way, the game changes to reflect this. Immediately, cases like Black Caesar and the setup start at night, and you begin to spend much more time in dark backstreet offices and sketchy mafia warehouses. And there's suddenly a lot of very deliberate high contrast lighting on display as well. And this is really cool, but it only partially lasts. While there are still some dark scenes after Vice, things mostly go back to normal once you hit the arson desk. It is still an improvement though, but in spite of that, I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. I've always been disappointed that this game only ever partially committed to the dark noir look. While it's cool from a storytelling perspective that the game gets darker over time, it always felt like too little too late. But again, I completely understand things from the developer's point of view. Putting my own expectations aside, I will defend this approach on a few different levels. Because from the developer's point of view, I completely understand why they would eschew from the more dreamlike influence of German Expressionism, in favor of something more grounded and naturalistic. To once again quote production designer Simon Wood, "We didn't want these amazingly subtle faces in an environment that didn't match. We knew the game had to be a time machine." Which, if you know anything about this game, is in reference to the motion capture facial performances, the revolutionary technology that defined the core of this game's experience. Ultra-realistic facial expressions that enabled the player to expertly identify when suspects were lying and when they were telling the truth, all through subtle facial cues. I know I've spent this whole video talking about art and the overworld and all that, but this was the true core of LA Noire. And so as much as one might like to see wicked atmospheric dreamscapes, you ultimately have to be consistent with your vision, and this was a vision defined by naturalism. And in complete fairness, it's not like Noir can't be played straight. There are a lot of people who, when they think of Noir, they think of these ultra moody atmospheric films, something akin to Blade Runner or Mulholland Drive. But when they watch a pure classic noir film like The Maltese Falcon, they might be surprised at just how dry and grounded it actually is. So the notion that a noir-inspired game has to be ultra-atmospheric is a false premise. However, I would argue that achieving believability and realism does not have to come at the cost of style. There's no reason you couldn't have used a lot of traditional high-contrast lighting and have had realistic facial animation. There's no reason you couldn't have had a good chunk of this game be set at night. And I get it, they were going for historical accuracy, and most detectives work during the day like everybody else. Most witnesses are not awake, ready to be interviewed at 3 a.m. But darkness and nighttime are just such quintessential elements of this genre that it feels ridiculous to minimize them. And when it does go full noir, it's incredible. This scene where you're walking through the Intolerance set on a stormy night is incredibly moody and cool. Being dwarfed by these giant, hollowed-out Babylonian statues in the dark is just so spooky, yet it never feels unrealistic. So yes, realism is important in a game like this, but at the end of the day, it's still a video game, one with a world that the developers and writers have complete control over, and sometimes mood and feel should take precedence. In the same Simon Wood interview, he talks about how the palm trees you see on the street of the game are not actually historically accurate. How in 1947 the actual imported trees were half the size of the ones you see in the final game, but these historically accurate ones looked really lame, saying, quote, "Sometimes you have to art direct past the reference." Hell, you want another example? The Intolerance set, the best locale in this game, was actually destroyed in 1919. But they still threw it into the final game anyway because it's super cool. And so I really would have liked them to have art directed past the reference a lot more often. In my opinion, one of the highest achievements a movie or a game can achieve in its art direction is style fused with realism. Worlds that manage to be both atmospheric and evocative, but still believable and authentic. And in my opinion, LA Noire misses the mark here. But perhaps that wasn't their goal. So who am I to judge? At the beginning, I brought up one of this video's main topics: realism versus surrealism. And I think I've been pretty clear that I'm more of a surrealist kind of guy, and that this game is, for the most part, very strongly skewed towards the opposite. And from a game design and visual perspective, we've seen the natural consequences that came from realism, like omnipotent daylight in a noir game and an overworld that's as boring to drive through as, well, Los Angeles. But you know what? That's okay, because this game had a vision, and I'm just some guy with my own taste and opinions. It's not my goal with this channel to say what a game should have been, but to approach it and accept it for what its creators wanted it to be. And I really do respect Team Bondi's vision. The strict decision to make this game an as accurate as possible time machine back to 1947 is a bold one that has downsides and one that I wasn't initially super happy with. But with the more time I've had to research and reflect on it, the more I see that this game was actually more culturally important for it. Los Angeles is a city whose image has long been painted by outsiders, by people who have moved there in search of some kind of glory or opportunity, and everyone, from famous writers to 2-bit starving artists, have all chimed in with their opinion of the city. This is the LA that everyone knows, the one on TV, the one you've read about but never actually visited or didn't grow up in. Hell, this game was developed in Sydney, Australia of all places. And so on many levels, it's much easier to engage with the caricature of LA. That crazy far-off city full of vain people and ego-driven Hollywood elites. Rarely, however, do we see the city in neutral terms. Los Angeles as it actually is, or in this case, actually was. It would have been easy to create a fantasy noir game, to create a warped, dreamlike version of 1947, one that obscures the finer details of its world in a hazy swath of darkness and surrealism. But they didn't do that. They gave us an accurate impression of the city as it was, not just as we imagine or fantasize it to be. And this is very culturally important in my opinion, because this place no longer exists. Sure, you can go fly to LA, but the 1947 version of the city has been lost to time. The same way that spending a week in Istanbul isn't gonna let you relive the days of the Byzantine Empire. Our modern Los Angeles is not the same world as LA Noire, as modern Los Angeles is a city notorious for reinventing itself. This digital city as we see it here has since been flattened and covered over. Most games that do feature period locations, like Assassin's Creed, usually do so through a sci-fi or fantasy lens. Yet, LA Noire showcases a potential that video games have that's rarely discussed. The potential for authentic historical and cultural preservation. 1947 Los Angeles may be lost, but in a small way, it will always live on through this game. And sure, the game may not be perfect. It may not always be super engaging to travel through, and it may not always be beautiful. But you know what? Neither is Los Angeles.